Hey, welcome. So I've had the Fuji x100v for over 3 months and a lot has happened since I bought it. I almost returned my camera, but then something started to change. I ended up changing my perception of street photography. All right, let's look into it. Let's start with a quick recap in case you haven't seen why I bought this camera. So I bought this camera because I wanted the camera to be a complete and true EDC, so everyday carry camera. And I also had 3 main reasons for buying this camera. So number 1 is that I wanted to document my life more in terms of those private moments, those casual moments with my friends and family. And the second reason was that I wanted my photography to be fun again. I felt like sometimes, also partly because of this channel, it felt like work sometimes, and I wanted my photography to be fun again. I also spent a lot of time post-processing, so I'm editing my photos because I shoot RAW. And one of the things that drew me to this camera is the film simulations, and I can shoot in JPEG, so I really wanted that as well. I also wanted to change and shift my photography a little bit in terms of how I take photos. I wanted to take more photographs where there are candid moments, you know, those raw emotion you can capture. And I felt like this camera, because of the small form factor, I could do that. And those were some of the reasons that I bought this camera initially a couple of months ago. I've been using the Fuji x100v exclusively for 3 months now, and I can say there are some pros and cons that I would talk about. So let's start with the pros. This is truly a EDC for me, and this is also the main reasons I bought it. So it is so small, it is so compact and lightweight that I can just throw it in my backpack, even if I plan on using it or not. A great way for me to just have my camera if something catches my eye. Another thing is that it fills the gap between my Sony a7C that has become more my workhorse, like in terms of filming, like for this YouTube channel. And I don't like to take photos with my iPhone because I prefer a real camera, and this camera fills that gap in between. Before I bought this camera, I felt like that I was out somewhere and I saw something interesting, and I would always wish that I had my camera with me, and having my bit more bulky camera, the Sony a7C, was not really an option, and the Fuji x100v really fills that gap for me. A couple of other things that I wanted to cover as pros are the film simulations. I really love that. I've been experimenting a lot, and I do shoot RAW and JPEG, but I rarely use the RAW file. It's just as backup because I like to have that control, but mainly I just edit my JPEGs. I crop it in a little bit, maybe shift the shadows a little bit, but that's about it. Otherwise, I use the film simulations that I've stored on this camera. And the last pro is the built-in small flash, which is really powerful. I've used it a lot since I bought it, mainly in those private, casual moments. I really love that direct flash 90s vibe. So those are some of the pros. All right, so let's talk quickly about some of the cons. I think the biggest con with this camera for me personally has been that I haven't gotten used to the camera. It took me a long time to get used to the dials because it has a lot of dials and buttons, and you can virtually customize any button on this camera. There are so many settings. And it took me a lot of practice going out and figuring out what I liked. That really annoyed me because on the Sony a7C, you don't really have that many options. Also, the ergonomics of this camera is really, really bad. I nearly dropped it a few times. I have this thumb grip on, which has helped a lot by stabilizing the camera in my hand. I also have this camera strap on my hand. I'm really afraid of dropping this camera because it is so small and the grip is virtually missing, as I mentioned before. The battery is really, really bad. I can get maybe an hour and a half on one charge, and also depending on the camera is on or off while I'm walking around. I tried to put it in sleep mode, and the boot up of this camera is really fast, but sometimes it's just annoying. You have to press the shutter for it to boot up. I put it in boost mode, which means that it's awake. It doesn't dim down the screen either, which is also really annoying. And you might think that I can easily buy a new battery, but one of my reasons for buying this camera was that I didn't want to invest any more gear, you know, the surrounding ecosystem of the camera. Also because it's really expensive right now. I will make do with this camera and this battery for as long as I can, but the battery is really terrible. This camera is really slow because if you use the film simulation, it has the clarity feature. If the clarity feature is on, it slows down the camera because it has to process the film simulation in the camera, and that takes a little bit. So sometimes it's just processing when you're trying to take another photo, and I missed a few shots because of that. And there is a workaround for that, to the camera not to be that slow, is to turn down or turn off the clarity setting in the film simulations. The camera will be a little bit faster, but yeah. When I bought this camera, I really wanted to use the aperture priority mode a lot because Years ago, when I was a beginner photographer, I used aperture priority mode and I really loved it. And since then, I've started to use manual mode. I don't know, for the life of me, I couldn't get used to the aperture priority mode on this camera. And that is not because of lack of trying. I really did try. So I actually pivoted back to manual mode. I still have the urge, even though I shoot in JPEGs and with film simulation, to edit my photos. But that's not a camera thing, that it's more a mindset thing for me. The biggest con for me is that I really can use this camera for night street photography as I'm used to with my Sony a7C. And to be completely fair, there is a lot of difference between this camera, which has one lens that cannot be changed, to my Sony a7C. And I also have very fast prime lenses, which are really good for night street photography because you can use it in low light. So it's not a fair comparison, but like personally for me, I really like night street photography. And I tried it a few times with this camera. It didn't work out because the lowest this camera and this lens can go is f2, which is on a crop body. I think it's around f3 when you factor in the crop factor. I think, and also compare that with the camera being a little bit slow. I don't pick this camera when I go out to do night street photography. Of course, if I have something specific I want to do, I bring it with me, but I prefer using my Sony a7C. Also, me using this camera for 3 months straight, I really understood what are the strengths of this camera and what are the weaknesses of this camera. Those were some of the pros and cons. How the Fuji x100v changed my approach to photography. Yes, that is a tall order, but that is exactly what happened. So I will cover both how my approach to settings changed and how my approach to editing changed. But let me start by saying that this camera has really reframed how I think about street photography. And after the initial get to know the camera and developing the muscle memory and also finding out what the strengths and weaknesses of this camera are, I really figured out how to use this camera really effectively and optimally for me and my type of street photography. Because I wanted to pivot my street style, change it up a little bit. Because if you've been following my channel, you know that I really like that high contrast, light and shadow, use my 85mm, be a little bit more further away from my subjects. I really wanted to flip that on its head and really try something different. I really wanted to get closer also as a challenge for myself. This camera, comparing that with the manual focus that I mentioned before, shooting in f8, it really changed my photography and how I see photography, especially street photography now, because the photographs that I'm able to take with this camera, they are so much more intimate and candid in their nature. I try to look for raw emotions when I'm taking photographs. I feel like I can be a little bit more stealthy or, you know, hide my camera a little bit so it's not that obvious what I'm doing. And the photos that I produce with this camera has been so different than my usual style, and I'm really, really loving it. It really brought fun and joy into my life again because it is so different than what I'm used to. And that doesn't mean that I don't like my other style, which is light and shadow and high contrast photos. And I still love my 85mm. I still love my 55mm, but there's something special about the 35mm as well. So a lot of things combined made me kind of shift my mindset around street photography and also reframe how I think about street photography. It took some time for this camera to be fully part of my street kit. And I think in the beginning, and also why I was considering selling this camera after a month, was that I didn't fully understand the capabilities of this camera. And I continued to use it even though I was a little bit annoyed and I felt like that I wasted $1,800 on this camera that is almost 3 years old. And I maybe got swayed by the popular opinion of YouTubers, people saying that this camera was all that. And I think after month 2, heading into month 3 of using this camera, my mindset really started to shift, and now I can fully say that this camera really belongs in my street kit. All right, so let me quickly cover how my approach to settings has changed using this camera. I mentioned before that I wanted to use aperture priority mode before I bought this camera, and it ended up being that I just stuck with manual mode. But what has changed is that since I started using manual focus and the zone focusing system on this camera, it really shifted my approach to settings as well. Because when you use zone focusing, it's best to use larger apertures like f8, f10, and so forth. And coming from a very fast lens ecosystem, I never did that. I think maybe I went to 5.6 if I wanted more sharpness, but I maybe hovered around 2.8 or 3.5 or something like that. So that was a really big shift for me in terms of my settings. And another thing is with this camera that because it's not full frame like my Sony a7C, you have to bump up the ISO a little bit. And some of the recipes that this camera has that I personally like, it's recommended to use higher ISOs. So one thing is to have larger apertures that I use in terms of settings. It doesn't have to be very fast anymore. And the other thing is that I often use higher ISO. I'm not that afraid, so to say, of using higher ISO now. I often use 1600 or maybe 3200 and sometimes even 6400 ISO. When using high ISO, it gives more grain, it gives more noise. But I think that's part of the charm when you're using film simulations, especially on this camera. Because if I wanted a digitally clean, very sharp looking photograph, I would technically use my Sony a7C with a very fast prime lens to reduce all that noise to have a very clean photo, like if I'm doing a portrait session. For this camera, I think it's completely fine that my photographs may not be always sharp. They often are blurry with this camera, and I don't care about, if there's a little bit movement in my camera as well in my photographs. And that is something I didn't really like because I really like clean shots. And that is also something that has changed in terms of changing the settings, because the settings are different with this camera and I really like it. All right, so let me talk about how the Fuji x100v has changed my approach to editing. So as I mentioned before, one of the main reasons why I bought this camera was that I wanted to minimize my editing time, and because I do spend a lot of time post-processing my photographs because they're often shot in RAW. I wanted an option where I could use the photographs straight out of camera in JPEG, and combining that with the film simulation, that really gives a good option for me to minimize a lot of the post-processing. And what I do now is that I shoot both in RAW and JPEG, but I hardly use the RAW files. I think in the 3 months that I've used this camera, I think I've edited the RAW files maybe a handful of times, so not a lot. But I mostly use the JPEG files, and I do crop in a little bit or maybe level the horizon because sometimes it's a little bit off. And once in a while I change maybe some of the settings, maybe the shadows, because I like to have low contrast. But that's about it. That's about the editing I do, and that has really saved me a lot of time because some of the recipes, they are so spot on in terms of the color science. One of my favorite film simulations that is native to this camera is Classic Negative, which is great for having those natural skin tones. It's really amazing, and I often use it when I'm shooting my private events, with friends and family. I can't believe I was this close to selling this camera, and I'm happy I didn't. It took a while for me to really understand how to use this camera that is best for me and my type of street photography. And it also took a little bit of time to really understand how this camera fitted into my other street kit. But I think I figured out the pros and cons and the strengths and weaknesses of this camera. I really believe that this camera has a proper place in my street kit. All right, take care. See you in the next one.